Lost Brothers, New War, The Return of the Primarchs. The Vox crackle dies mid-transmission, and in that silence you hear it, the sound of something ancient stirring beneath 10,000 years of dust and nightmare. That is the sound the galaxy made when Roboute Guilliman opened his eyes again, when the Lord of Ultramar drew breath in a universe that had forgotten what hope tasted like. They told you the Primarchs were gone, ascended into myth or consumed by the Long War, but they lied. They return now, one by one, and with them comes a reckoning that will break the Imperium, or remake it in ways that would make even the Emperor weep, if he still possessed the faculties for such human weakness. The first thing Guilliman saw was not light, but the absence of it, a greasy darkness that clung to the edges of his vision like oil on water. His body remembered agony before his mind did, the phantom sensation of Fulgrim's poison blade carving through ceramite and gene-enhanced flesh, the burning kiss of the anatheme as it delivered its venom into his hearts. He had been dying then, suspended in that crystalline moment between life and true death, preserved in a stasis field that held him like amber holds the ancient insects of forgotten ages. The tech priests of Ultramar had kept vigil over his frozen form for millennia, their rituals of maintenance becoming religion, their hope calcifying into hollow liturgy. They prayed to the Omnissiah for his return, but prayers in the 41st millennium are dangerous things, for in this darkness something always listens. Call had done the impossible, though at what cost remained to be calculated in currencies the Mechanicus rarely acknowledged. The Archmagos Dominus had worked in secret for 10,000 years, piecing together fragments of forbidden lore and heretical innovation, walking the razored edge between salvation and damnation with each blasphemous calculation. The armor. Indomitus hummed with technologies that predated the Imperium itself, systems that should not function, should not exist, pulled from the hidden vaults beneath Mars and from places even darker still. When Call's machines pumped the Primarchs' hearts and forced resurrection through his veins, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Some say the Astronomicon flickered in that moment, that Terra's light dimmed as if in recognition or perhaps in fear. The Custodian Guard, those golden sentinels who stand eternal watch over the throne world, felt something shift in the deep places beneath the palace, a stirring in chambers that had been sealed since the heresy's end. Guilliman rose into a universe drowning in its own mythology. He had expected to wake to an Imperium still fighting, still growing, still reaching toward the secular enlightenment his father had envisioned during those golden years of the Great Crusade. Instead, he found a theocratic nightmare, a civilization that had devoured itself from within and learned to call the decay holy. The Emperor, his father, the being who had rejected divinity and condemned the primitive superstitions of old night, now sat enthroned as the central deity of the largest religion humanity had ever conceived. Trillions upon uncounted trillions bent their knees and offered their screams to a corpse god, their prayers feeding something vast and incomprehensible that wore the Emperor's image like a mask. The ecclesiarchy sprawled across the Imperium like a cancer dressed in gold and crimson, its ministorum cardinals wielding power that would have seen them executed during the Great Crusade's height. The first time Guilliman walked the corridors of the imperial palace, he moved like a ghost through halls he no longer recognized. The architecture remained, those soaring arches and impossible geometries designed by minds that had touched the mathematical sublime, but everything else had changed. Where once stood monuments to reason and achievement, now rose altars and devotional sculptures, their surfaces thick with the residue of incense and the molecular traces of 1 billion prayers. Servo skulls drifted through the corridors, their augmetic sensors tracking his passage with mechanical interest, their vox grills whispering liturgical cant in languages that had evolved past sense into pure ritual sound. He saw chapter serfs prostrate themselves before shrine alcoves containing fragments of bone and scraps of cloth, relics whose authenticity mattered less than the fervor they inspired. The Imperium had become everything his father had fought to prevent, and the bitter irony carved itself into Guilliman's gene-enhanced consciousness like acid etching steel. The meeting with the High Lords of Terra unfolded with all the theatrical horror of a morality play staged in a charnel house. They sat in their thrones, these masters of humanity's scattered dominions, wrapped in robes that cost more than entire star systems generated in tax revenue. The master of the administratum, his face a mass of augmetic reconstruction and life extension surgery, regarded the returned Primarch with eyes that calculated political ramifications before acknowledging the sheer impossible fact of resurrection. The ecclesiarch, bloated with temporal power and spiritual corruption in equal measure, radiated a certainty so absolute it bordered on madness, his every word dripping with the honeyed poison of faith perverted into control. The fabricator, General's mechanical countenance betrayed nothing, but Guilliman could read the tension in the way his servo arms adjusted and readjusted their angles, a telltale sign of deep processing activity, and perhaps something approaching what humanity once called anxiety. They did not welcome him as a savior. They received him as a threat, a fundamental disruption to the careful balance of incompetence and corruption that had kept them fed and comfortable while the Imperium burned. Guilliman looked at these men and women, these supposed shepherds of humanity's flock, and saw only parasites wearing the masks of authority. They had forgotten what the Imperium was built for, forgotten that every regulation, every tithe, every sacrifice demanded from the common citizenry was meant to serve a greater purpose beyond their own accumulation of influence. The endless bureaucracy that choked every world from the core territories to the fringe had become an end unto itself, a self-perpetuating mechanism that consumed resources and produced nothing but more paperwork and more functionaries to shuffle that paperwork from one side of the galaxy to the other. The first purge came quietly, a series of accidents and sudden retirements that left vacancies, Guilliman filled with individuals whose competence he could verify. The second purge came with bolt rounds and the testimony of the custodian guard, those incorruptible warriors whose mere presence shattered the comfortable lies the High Lords had wrapped around themselves like burial shrouds. 3 of the 12 lost their heads in the space of a solar day, their crimes read aloud in voices that echoed through Vox networks spanning 1,000,000 worlds. Embezzlement on scales that beggared comprehension, the diversion of resources meant for hive-world food shipments into private accounts, the selling of regimental positions to incompetent noble scions while qualified officers rotted in obscurity. The Imperium had been cannibalizing itself for so long that many no longer recognized the practice as anything but standard procedure. But Guilliman's return was only the beginning, the first crack in a dam that had held back 10,000 years of consequence and choice. Somewhere in the warp-touched nightmares of the Eye of Terror, other Primarchs stirred in their torment and their dark glory. The demon Primarchs had never truly left, had never stopped their long war against the corpse realm their father had built, but now they sensed a shift in the game's parameters. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, felt it in the thrumming of the great ocean's tides, a disturbance that rippled backward and forward through time's non-linear structure. Mortarion, the Lord of Death, paused in his endless catalogue of plagues and pestilences, his gene-forged senses detecting something that cut through even Nurgle's numbing gifts. Fulgrim heard it as a discordant note in the eternal symphony of sensation and excess, a reminder of what he had been before ascension transformed him into something simultaneously more and horrifically less than human. The loyal Primarch's fate proved even more complex, wrapped in mystery and conflicting accounts that the Inquisition spent fortunes trying to verify or suppress in equal measure. Leman Russ had vanished into the Eye of Terror itself, chasing his treacherous brother Magnus with all the Wolf King's legendary fury, but some claimed his hunt had evolved into something stranger, that he walked paths through the warp that should have driven any being mad. Jagatai Khan rode into the webway and never returned, the white scars maintaining their vigil for a father who might emerge from any portal, any hidden gate, bearing secrets that would reshape humanity's understanding of the Eldar's ancient road network. Korax retreated into shadow and rage after the Raven Guard's decimation, and those few who claimed to have glimpsed him in the millennia since spoke of something no longer entirely Primarch, something that had learned to weaponize darkness itself. Vulcan's perpetual nature meant death could never truly claim him, but his absences stretched across centuries before each return, and the salamanders whispered that each resurrection cost him pieces of the man he had been, replacing memory and warmth with something colder, more ancient, more aligned with the deep fires of Nocturne's core. Rogel Dorn's fate twisted the knife of loss in ways peculiar to the sons of the Seventh Legion. His hand, recovered from a boarding action against a Chaos warship, sat preserved in stasis within the Temple of Oaths on Phalanx, but no body had ever been found. The Imperial Fists maintained that their Primarch had died defending the Imperium, yet they also maintained rituals suggesting his return, a cognitive dissonance that would have seemed contradictory in any other context, but made perfect sense in the 41st millennium's logic of desperation and faith. The Black Templars, taking Dorn's most furious aspects and weaponizing them into perpetual crusade, believed their gene-sire lived still, fighting in places beyond the Imperium's light. The Crimson Fists held to their stoic duty, honoring Dorn's memory while refusing to indulge in speculation. All three successor legions bore the weight of his absence differently, but the weight remained constant, a pressure that shaped their tactics and philosophy across 10,000 years of warfare. Lionel Johnson's situation approached the threshold of the absurd in its tragic complexity. The Dark Angels' Primarch lay sleeping in the depths of the rock, their mobile fortress monastery, hidden in a chamber even the chapter's inner circle did not know existed. The Watchers in the dark, those robed enigmas who moved through the Dark Angels' halls like animate secrets, maintained their vigil over their sleeping charge, waiting for some prophesied moment when his awakening would serve purposes that transcended even the Imperium's survival. The Dark Angels hunted their fallen with an obsession that bordered on pathological, their shame over the betrayal during the heresy-consuming resources and attention that might have been directed toward external threats. If they knew their Primarch slept beneath their feet, would it have changed anything? Or would the knowledge simply have added another layer of secrecy to a chapter already drowning in its own lies and compartmentalized truth? Guilliman learned these things in fragments, piecing together 10 millennia of history from sources that contradicted each other with frustrating regularity. The Imperium kept records obsessively, generating more data in a single day than any human mind could process in multiple lifetimes. Yet those records proved worse than useless. Scribes copied errors generation after generation, until the mistakes became canon, indistinguishable from truth. Deliberate falsifications by the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, and various other power blocks meant that researching any event older than a century required cross-referencing dozens of sources, and assuming all of them contained calculated distortions. Some knowledge had been actively suppressed, burned from archives, and purged from databanks, its absence creating holes in history that filled with speculation and myth. The Great Crusade itself existed more as legend than fact for most imperial citizens, and when Guilliman tried to correct the most egregious misconceptions, he found that truth held less currency than the comforting fictions humanity had constructed to explain its place in an uncaring cosmos. The Indomitus Crusade represented Guilliman's attempt to halt the Imperium's slide into terminal decline, a vast military undertaking that deployed the Primaris Space Marines and reclaimed worlds cut off by the Cicatrix Maledictum's terrible birth. That great wound in reality, the rift that split the galaxy from the core to the rim, had swallowed entire sectors and rendered whole segmentums effectively autonomous. Travel through the warp, already dangerous beyond the comprehension of any sane being, became actively suicidal in the rift's vicinity. Navigator houses reported losses that would have bankrupted them if not for the desperate demand for their services. Astropaths screamed themselves hollow, trying to send messages through the psychic static, their minds burning out like cheap lumens subjected to power surges. The Imperium, already barely functional, threatened to fragment entirely into isolated pocket kingdoms, each one slowly dying as it exhausted local resources without hope of reinforcement or relief. The Primaris Marines were Call's other great work, the Archmagos' attempt to improve upon the Emperor's own design through technologies that verged on the heretical. Larger, stronger, more resilient than their firstborn brothers, Equipped with organs and enhancements that pushed the boundaries of what transhuman meant, they represented hope and insult in equal measure. The original Space Marine chapters received these reinforcements with reactions spanning the spectrum from gratitude to outrage. Some chapter masters saw the Primaris as the Emperor's gift, a tool to finally turn the tide against the long war's grinding attrition. Others viewed them as replacements, a tacit admission that the original Marines had failed in their sacred duty. Tensions simmered beneath the surface of even the most successful integrations, theological arguments about the sanctity of Guilliman's original Codex Astartes clashing with pragmatic acceptance of the Primaris' superior capabilities. Robout Guilliman walked through this nightmare of his own legacy and felt something close to despair, though he would never name it such. He had built systems designed to function without him, safeguards and structures meant to preserve the Imperium through the centuries he knew must pass before humanity could stand entirely on its own. Instead, those systems had calcified into instruments of oppression, his own words in the Codex Astartes twisted into inflexible dogma. Chapter masters quoted passages at him, using his own strategic doctrine to justify decisions he would never have made, telling him he was wrong about what he had meant because the interpretation had achieved sacred status somewhere in the intervening millennia. The irony would have been funny if it was not so deeply, profoundly tragic. Then the visions started, dreams that felt more real than waking, moments when Guilliman's consciousness seemed to brush against something vast and terrible that wore his father's psychic signature. The Emperor spoke to him, or something claiming to be the Emperor did, its voice a million screaming souls compressed into approximate communication. The words made sense, and no sense simultaneously, instructions and warnings delivered in formats that transcended language's normal operation. Guilliman would wake from these encounters with knowledge he had not possessed before, strategic insights and factual information about current galactic conditions he had no way of verifying until events confirmed their accuracy. The Custodian Guard acknowledged these communications with their characteristic inscrutability, neither confirming nor denying their source, but Guilliman noted their increased attentiveness whenever he mentioned the visions. The question that haunted him, that he dared not speak aloud even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was what exactly sat upon the golden throne. The Emperor had been the greatest psyker in human history, a being of such vast psychic power that his mere presence could alter reality's local parameters. 10,000 years of worship had fed that presence, trillions upon uncounted trillions of human souls crying out to a deity they believed heard their prayers. In the warp, belief held tangible power, faith made manifest through the psychic gestalt of humanity's collective unconscious. Had that worship changed the Emperor, transformed him from a transcendent human into something approaching an actual god? Did the being that sometimes spoke to Guilliman still contain anything resembling his father's consciousness, or had it become something else entirely, a divine tulpa constructed from humanity's desperate need for a savior? The Custodian Guard offered no answers, their duty binding them to silence on matters concerning their lord. They stood their eternal watch, protecting something that might no longer need protection, serving a master who might have transcended the very concept of service. Guilliman saw how they looked at him, these engineered warriors who had fought beside the Emperor during the dark age of technology's final moments, and recognized something in their golden eyes. Pity, perhaps, or sorrow at what he represented. A son returned to find his father transformed beyond recognition, a relationship reduced to one-way communication that might be nothing more than his own psyche trying to fill the void left by genuine connection's absence. Other signs suggested more Primarchs would return, whispers and portents that the Ordo Malleus tracked with increasing alarm. The Grey Knights, those daemon hunters who stood as humanity's ultimate defense against Chaos's predations, reported unusual warp activity around locations significant to the missing loyal Primarchs. Fenris experienced phenomena the Space Wolves refused to discuss, manifestations in the frozen wastes that left behind claw marks in bedrock, and the lingering scent of something that was wolf and more than wolf. Chogoris's steps saw riders moving at impossible speeds through storms of manifest psychic energy, racing toward or away from something the local White Scar successors tried unsuccessfully to intercept. Nocturne's volcanoes erupted in patterns the Promethean cult recognized from prophecies older than the Imperium itself, apocalyptic verses that spoke of fire returning to cleanse a galaxy drowning in darkness. The demon Primarchs felt it too, this shift in cosmic architecture that suggested the game's rules were changing yet again. Angron manifested in real space with increasing frequency, the Red Angel's fury burning hotter than ever as he led his World Eaters in orgies of violence that left entire systems depopulated. Each manifestation lasted longer than the last, Khorne's hold on the material plane strengthening as the Blood God's followers fed him an endless buffet of slaughter. Mortarian's Death Guard pressed deeper into Ultramar, the plague wars threatening to corrupt Guilliman's own realm into a festering garden of decay. Magnus prosecuted his vengeance against the Space Wolves with renewed vigor, the Crimson King's sorceries reaching new heights of devastation as he attempted to prove himself more than the broken puppet his father's censure had made him. Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, remained in his fortress of Medrengard, that impossible structure of non-Euclidean architecture and impossible angles, crafting war machines that should not function according to any physics that still pretended to objective reality. His Iron Warriors struck from the Eye of Terror with strategic precision, targeting infrastructure and supply lines with the cold calculation that had always defined their gene-sire's approach to warfare. Where other traitor legions indulged in excess and theatricality, the Iron Warriors waged war with grim efficiency, their siegecraft refined across 10,000 years into something approaching a dark art. Perturabo hated his brothers, despised them for achieving demonhood, while he remained stubbornly, furiously material. Yet that hatred only sharpened his edge against the Imperium that had never appreciated his contributions. Lorgar, the first to fall, the architect of the entire heresy, through his desperate search for divinities worth worshipping, had retreated into contemplation within the warp's depths. The Word-bearers prosecuted their eternal crusade without his direct guidance, spreading the Chaos God's worship through fire and conversion, but their Primarch's absence created strange vacuum that even his most devoted followers struggled to understand. Some claimed Lorgar had achieved apotheosis beyond even demonhood, that he existed now as pure theology given semi-conscious form. Others suggested he had finally recognized the emptiness at Chaos Worship's heart, and retreated into madness, trying to reconcile that knowledge with 10 millennia of devoted service. The truth remained hidden behind veils of deliberate mystification, and the simple fact that tracking a being existing partially outside linear time proved effectively impossible. Alfarius or Omegon, whichever remained if either still existed, played games within games that made even the Inquisition's most convoluted plots look straightforward by comparison. The Alpha Legion operated everywhere and nowhere, their agents embedded so deeply in imperial institutions that rooting them out required destroying those institutions entirely. They supported chaos and fought against it, betrayed the Imperium and defended it, their actions following logic so Byzantine that attempting to understand their ultimate goal could drive analysts into catatonic confusion. Guilliman had given up trying to predict the Alpha Legion's movements, instead focusing on damage control and hoping that whatever endgame they pursued aligned with the Imperium's survival, at least temporarily. The Cicatrix Maledictum's existence meant that the traitor Primarchs could manifest in real space more easily than before, the Great Rift providing conduits and weak points where the warp's infection bled into material reality. Guilliman organized defensive lines and rapid response forces, preparing for the inevitable day when multiple demon Primarchs would coordinate their efforts rather than pursuing individual agendas. That coordination represented an apocalyptic scenario, the kind of threat that could finish what the Horus Heresy had started, but he suspected the Chaos Gods would never allow their champions to cooperate meaningfully. The Ruinous Powers played their great game, primarily against each other, using real space as merely one board among infinite others, and their agents' effectiveness suffered from that eternal rivalry. Meanwhile, the question of the missing loyal Primarchs gnawed at Guilliman's strategic calculations. If even one more could be found, recovered, restored to functionality, the psychological impact alone would be worth multiple crusade fleets. The common imperial citizens needed hope desperately, something to believe in beyond empty liturgies and the distant promise of salvation after death. The Space Marines needed their gene sires, the living connection to the Emperor's vision that no amount of chapter tradition could truly replace. The Imperium needed examples of what humanity could achieve when it reached toward its potential, rather than cowering in fear of its own shadow. Expeditions deployed toward the locations where the missing Primarchs had last been reliably recorded, each one a monumental undertaking that drained resources from a treasury already dangerously depleted. The mission to Fenris's coordinates involved 6 full battle companies of Space Wolves and their successors, supported by Battlefleet Obscurus elements and a contingent of Adeptus Mechanicus explorators whose enthusiasm for recovering Russ bordered on manic obsession. They found nothing, or found things they refused to discuss in official reports, their Vox transmissions degrading into static whenever they approached certain subjects. The expedition to the Webway's suspected entry points ended in catastrophe, Drukhari raiders ambushing the Imperial forces and dragging away hundreds of prisoners into Comrog's nightmare spires before the survivors could retreat. The attempt to locate Korax proved even more disturbing. Scout parties sent into the regions where the Raven Lord had last been sighted returned changed, their speech patterns altered, their eyes reflecting light at angles that suggested modifications no apothecary had authorized. They spoke of shadows with weight and substance, of darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence, of places where light feared to penetrate not because of mere absence, but because of active repulsion. The Inquisition quarantined these returning scouts, studying them for signs of corruption or possession, finding nothing definitively wrong, yet unable to shake the conviction that something fundamental had shifted in their nature. Eventually, they were quietly executed, their gene seed harvested, and placed in special containment that the Mechanicus monitored with unusual intensity. Vulcan's periodic returns offered a pattern that the Salamander's Forge Masters tried desperately to predict, seeking some mathematical constant in his appearances that might allow them to anticipate his next manifestation. He would arrive without warning, fight alongside his sons for campaigns that lasted years or decades, then vanish as mysteriously as he had come, drawn towards some purpose he refused or could not explain. Each time, he seemed more distant, more like a force of nature than a person, his famous compassion still present but muted, filtered through 10,000 years of death and resurrection. The Salamanders loved him, revered him as few, chapters managed with their Primarchs, yet they also feared what he was becoming, what price perpetual existence extracted from the soul. The Lion's potential awakening posed unique problems that Guilliman recognized with growing concern. If L. Johnson woke and learned what the Dark Angels had become, learned about the Fallen and the obsessive hunt that had consumed his Legion's successors, the confrontation would tear the First Legion apart. The Dark Angels had built their entire identity around the shame of betrayal and the need for redemption through the Fallen's complete eradication. Their Primarch's return would force them to choose between the man who had led them during the Great Crusade and the institution they had built in his absence. Guilliman knew the Dark Angels' stubbornness, had fought beside them often enough to respect and occasionally curse their inflexibility, and he suspected that choice would not resolve peacefully. Yet he needed them, needed every loyal Space Marine chapter if the Imperium was to survive the coming storm. The Death Guard pressed ever deeper into Ultramar's borders, Nurgle's garden spreading like infection through systems that had stood pure since the Great Crusade's height. Mortarion commanded this invasion personally, his hatred for Guilliman burning with the steady intensity of fever heat. The two had never been close, the Death Lord's bitter cynicism clashing with Guilliman's pragmatic optimism. But their fraternal conflict had remained theoretical until Mortarion's damnation transformed philosophical disagreement into open warfare. Now they met on battlefields where reality itself grew sick, where the air curdled with contagion and the very laws of entropy accelerated toward heat death. The Plague Wars tested Guilliman in ways the Horus Heresy never had. Then he had been one Primarch among many, his role defined by larger strategic concerns and the comfort of brotherhood. Now he stood alone, the last loyal son available to the Imperium, bearing responsibility for decisions that would affect trillions. Every choice involved impossible mathematics, the calculus of triage performed on planetary scales. Which worlds to defend and which to abandon, how many lives to sacrifice for strategic positions, when to commit reserves, and when to accept tactical losses rather than risk operational collapse. He made these decisions with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his approach to governance on Macragge, but each one cost him something, carved away pieces of the man who had once believed reason and proper organization could solve any problem. Mortarion knew this, delighted in it, conducting the war as much to torture his brother as to achieve military objectives. The Death Guard would strike at civilian populations first, forcing Guilliman to divert forces to humanitarian relief when strategic targets beckoned. They would infect local water supplies with plagues that killed slowly, painfully, their victims' prolonged suffering serving Nurgle's purposes while compelling the Ultramarines to remain in system rather than pursuing the attackers. Mortarion appeared personally at battles where his presence served no tactical purpose, forcing Guilliman to engage in direct combat when his talents were better suited to strategic command, always withdrawing before resolution could be achieved, leaving his brother frustrated and exhausted. The psychological warfare worked, wearing down Guilliman's composure through accumulated frustration. He found himself making mistakes, small errors of judgment that only became visible after the fact, his transhuman mind struggling with exhaustion it should have been engineered to overcome. The visions from the Golden Throne increased in frequency and intensity, their messages growing more urgent, more fragmented, as if the Emperor or the thing claiming to be him sensed his son's deterioration. Guilliman resisted the temptation to increase his exposure to these communications, fearing dependency on guidance that might be nothing more than his own subconscious trying to process impossible circumstances through pareidolia and psychological projection. Then reports arrived of something new manifesting in the Eye of Terror, a phenomenon that made even the demon Primarchs pause in their eternal games. The Inquisition's sources, those networks of spies and informants that the Ordo Malleus maintained at terrible cost, spoke of a gathering, a convocation of powers that had not occurred since the Horus Heresy's immediate aftermath. The Chaos Gods themselves seemed to be focusing their attention on some matter of mutual concern, their great game temporarily suspended in recognition of circumstances that threatened or promised to reshape the cosmos. The demonic legions pulled back from assaults that should have been pressed, withdrawing to the warp with none of their characteristic resistance, as if recalled for purposes that transcended individual campaigns. Guilliman consulted with the Grey Knight's Grand Masters, those warrior mystics who understood the warp's nature better than any beings save perhaps the Emperor himself. They offered theories couched in deliberately vague terminology, their knowledge constrained by oaths, and the simple fact that speaking certain truths too clearly could make those truths infectious. The Chaos Gods feared something, or anticipated something, or desired something with unusual unity of purpose. The Grey Knight suspected it related to the Emperor's status, to the possibility that the worship sustaining him on the Golden Throne was reaching some critical threshold where quantitative accumulation of faith transformed into qualitative change in nature. If the Emperor was becoming a true god, assuming that transition had not already occurred in ways humanity's limited perception could not detect, then the Chaos Gods might finally face a warp entity capable of challenging their dominion. But that transformation, if it occurred or was occurring, came with costs that Guilliman found himself unable to accept, even as he acknowledged their necessity. The Emperor's vision for humanity had always centered on reason's triumph over superstition, on human agency and the rejection of comfortable lies in favor of difficult truths. If he became a god, genuinely divine rather than merely worshipped as such, that vision died completely. Humanity would have its protector, its salvation, but at the price of everything that made humanity worth protecting. They would be eternal children, forever dependent on a divine parent, never achieving the adult independence that the Emperor had fought to provide. Yet the alternative looked like extinction, the human species consumed by predators who viewed mortal civilizations as livestock at best, cosmic jokes to be tortured for amusement at worst. The Necrons awakened from their millions of years of slumber, finding the galaxy colonized by upstart species whose very existence offended their ancient pride. The Tyranids approached from beyond the galaxy's rim, drawn by the Astronomican's light, or by the psychic beacon that was Terra itself, their hunger absolute, and their numbers effectively infinite. The Orcs waged their eternal war with increased sophistication, their Wa energies fed by the galaxy-spanning conflict until some war bosses achieved sizes and power levels not seen since the War of the Beast. The Eldari, both Craftworld and Drukhari varieties, pursued agendas that treated human survival as secondary to their own desperate attempts at continued existence. Every species, every faction, saw humanity as either enemy or resource, and the Imperium's military capacity proved increasingly inadequate to the task of fighting on infinite fronts simultaneously. This was the context in which Guilliman calculated the potential return of his brothers, the framework through which he evaluated whether their awakening represented salvation or simply another complication in an already impossibly complex situation. Some of the missing Primarchs would be assets, warriors, and leaders whose capabilities could turn entire campaigns. Others might prove more dangerous than their absence, their psychological damage and accumulated trauma making them unstable in ways that enhanced strength and intelligence would only amplify. Dorn's stolid determination would be invaluable, but if he had survived rather than died, what had sustained him through 10,000 years of warfare? What had that longevity cost him? What pieces of the man had been sacrificed to maintain the warrior's functionality? Russ, if he could be found and convinced to return, brought complications of his own. The Wolf King had always been the Emperor's executioner, the one Primarch designed specifically for fratricide, the ultimate sanction against brothers who strayed too far from compliance. That role had defined him, shaped his Legion's culture and tactics, but what purpose did an executioner serve when most of his potential targets were already dead or damned beyond redemption? The Space Wolves maintained their savage mystique, playing to the image of barbarism while possessing sophistication they deliberately concealed, but Guilliman wondered if Russ would recognize his Legion's current iteration. The Wolf King had been many things, but subtle was not among them, and the political games his sons now played seemed antithetical to his straightforward approach to problems. The Khan represented perhaps the most uncertain quantity, his nature always the most inscrutable of the loyal Primarchs. Jagatai had never been interested in administration or the building of empires, viewing the Imperium's bureaucratic necessities with barely concealed disdain. He fought for freedom, for the right to ride where he wished and challenge himself against worthy opponents, and the 41st millennium offered no freedom save that which could be carved from hostile territory at sword's point. If the Khan emerged from the webway bearing knowledge of its structure and operation, the strategic implications would be immense, potentially offering alternatives to warp travel that would revolutionize Imperial logistics. But knowledge came with risk, especially knowledge taken from the Eldar's greatest achievement, and Guilliman wondered what price that knowledge might demand. Corax troubled him most among the missing loyalists. The Raven Lord had been broken by the heresy in ways the others had not been. His legion's near extinction at the drop site massacre on Istvan V cutting something vital from his psyche. Guilliman had seen him after, had watched his brother retreat into vengeance and shadow, and recognized the edge of something that might be madness, or might be evolution, into something post-Primarch. The reports from scout parties, the accounts of shadows with intelligence and purpose, suggested Corax had not merely hidden, but transformed, learning to navigate the spaces between light and darkness with preternatural skill. That transformation might make him a weapon of terrible potency, but weapons required wielders, and Guilliman suspected Corax would accept direction from no one, perhaps not even from the Emperor himself. Then there was Sanguinius, the absent presence that haunted every strategic discussion and theological debate. The angel had died on the vengeful spirit, murdered by Horus in that final confrontation, his sacrifice creating the opening that allowed the Emperor to board and confront the War Master. Yet rumors persisted, whispered in the Blood Angel's halls, and among the sanguinary priests who guarded their chapter's genetic mysteries. Some claimed fragments of the great angel's presence remained, echo copies preserved in the psychic gestalt of his bloodline, waiting for circumstances that might allow reconstruction. Others spoke of prophecies suggesting his return, apocalyptic verses that promised the angel's wings would shelter humanity in its darkest hour. Guilliman dismissed these as wishful thinking, the desperate hope of sons who could not accept their father's death. But sometimes he wondered if hope itself might have power in a universe where belief shaped reality. The prospect of multiple Primarchs working in concert, as they had during the Great Crusade's glory years, dangled before Guilliman like a mirage that grew more convincing the longer he stared. Together, they had conquered the galaxy, brought the scattered remnants of humanity into something approaching unity, pushed back the darkness, and claimed the stars as their birthright. Surely they could do so again, apply their gene-engineered brilliance to the Imperium's problems, and forge solutions that mere mortals could not conceive. But that logic ignored the changes 10,000 years had wrought, assumed the Primarchs remained who they had been when nothing else in the Imperium had resisted time's corrosive effects. It assumed they could cooperate, could subordinate individual agendas to collective necessity, despite the fact that such cooperation had always been fragile even before the heresy shattered it completely. Guilliman thought of Magnus, the Crimson King, who had tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal and been condemned for the warning's method. Magnus had loved their father, had pursued knowledge with a passion that matched the Emperor's own, yet that love and passion had driven him to damnation when censure and punishment made him vulnerable to Tzeentch's manipulations. If Magnus could fall, if the Primarch specifically designed to master psychic powers could be corrupted, then what hope did the others have? What combination of circumstances and psychology made any of them truly proof against the ruinous power's predations? Guilliman knew his own weaknesses, his tendency toward arrogance disguised as efficiency, his occasional inability to recognize that not all problems submitted to organizational solutions. He had resisted chaos thus far, but he had also been dead for most of the intervening millennia, removed from the slow erosion that eternally living in the 41st millennium's horror inflicted. The other loyal Primarchs had not enjoyed that escape through death and resurrection. They had endured, fought, witnessed the Imperium's gradual decline, watched the Emperor's dream corrode into nightmare. That kind of psychological damage accumulated, changing people in ways they might not recognize themselves, normalizing atrocities through repeated exposure until the unthinkable became merely operational necessity. Guilliman saw it in himself already, the way he had begun to view worlds as numbers on strategic displays rather than places where trillions of actual humans lived actual lives. He caught himself making calculations his pre-death self would have rejected as monstrous, justifying them through appeal to the greater good and the recognition that mercy to the few guaranteed destruction for the many. How much more pronounced would that transformation be in brothers who had never experienced the reset that death and resurrection provided? Yet he needed them, however changed they might be, because the alternatives offered only variations on extinction. The Imperium could not survive another 10,000 years of its current trajectory, could barely survive another 1,000. The systems that had kept it functioning were collapsing, the infrastructure maintained through redundancy and the sheer inertia of bureaucratic process finally succumbing to accumulated damage. Forge worlds that had produced equipment for 100 centuries fell silent as they exhausted irreplaceable resources, their magos unable to recreate technologies they had preserved through rote repetition rather than genuine understanding. Agri-worlds suffered crop failures as climates shifted under the weight of millennia of exploitation, their populations starving, even as the administratum demanded ever-increasing tithes based on projections calculated from data centuries obsolete. Hive worlds descended into revolution and cannibalism as supply chains broke, and the delicate balance between overcrowding and subsistence collapsed entirely. Guilliman witnessed these catastrophes in fragments, receiving reports from a million worlds where disaster unfolded in slow motion or explosive immediacy. He deployed what forces he could spare, attempting triage on a galactic scale, knowing that every intervention meant accepting tragedy elsewhere. The Indomitus Crusade had reclaimed territory and stabilized fronts, but reclamation and stabilization were not victory, merely the prevention of immediate defeat. He needed to transition from defensive operations to offensive campaigns, needed to take the war to the Imperium's enemies rather than constantly reacting to their initiatives. But that transition required resources he did not possess, and probably would never possess under current strategic constraints. The Primaris Marines helped, their enhanced capabilities multiplying effective combat power, but they were not a panacea. They died like any other Marines when overwhelmed by superior numbers or outmaneuvered by competent opposition. Their psychological integration with firstborn Marines created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence, brothers fighting brothers over precedents and theological interpretations of the Codex Astartes. Some chapters rejected the Primaris entirely, viewing them as corruption of the sacred gene seed, while others embraced them to the exclusion of firstborn recruitment, creating generational divides that would echo through centuries of chapter politics. Guilliman had created a tool, but tools required wisdom in their application, and wisdom proved perpetually in short supply. The theological dimensions of his return continued to complicate every interaction with imperial institutions. The ecclesiarchy preached about him in terms that made his transhuman skin crawl, describing his resurrection as miracle and proof of the God Emperor's grace. They positioned him as avatar and prophet, the living saint who would lead humanity to final victory over the forces of darkness. Citizens prayed to him, built shrines containing his image, attributed to him powers and capabilities he did not possess. He became myth while still living, his actual presence less important than the symbolic weight his existence carried in the Imperium's collective consciousness. When he tried to correct the most egregious distortions, to explain that he was a general and administrator rather than a religious figure, his denials were incorporated into the mythology as tests of faith or evidence of holy humility. The custodian guard observed all of this with their characteristic detachment. Their loyalty focused on the emperor rather than his sons. They obeyed Guilliman's legitimate orders, provided security and strategic counsel when requested, but he could feel their assessment, their constant evaluation of whether his actions served or hindered their master's purposes. They had stood beside the emperor since before the Unification Wars, had watched the Primarchs' creation and dispersal, had fought through the heresy and the scouring that followed. They remembered what the Primarchs had been at their best and worst, and Guilliman suspected their standards for acceptable behavior remained anchored to that historical baseline, rather than adjusted for current circumstances. He represented continuity to them, a connection to their master's original vision, but also potential threat if his goals diverged from what they believed the emperor would want. In his private moments, increasingly rare as strategic demands consumed every waking hour, Guilliman wondered if his brothers dreamed. Did Primarchs sleep in any conventional sense, or did their transhuman physiology permit something closer to meditation, while their bodies performed maintenance and consolidation routines? He remembered dreams from before, fragments of imagery and sensation that felt more real than memory, but less concrete than lived experience. Sometimes those dreams had seemed prophetic, showing him futures that subsequently manifested, or warnings about threats he had not consciously registered. Now his sleep periods, when he permitted them, filled with visions whose origins he could not definitively trace. Some clearly came from the Golden Throne, messages embedded in formats his gene-engineered neurology could decode. Others felt different, arising from somewhere deeper, perhaps from the psychic architecture underlying reality itself, the warp's constant pressure against the Materium's fragile boundaries. In one recurring vision, he stood on Terra during the siege, watching the palace burn, while Horus's forces pressed ever closer to the Sanctum Imperialis. But in this version, he was present when the Emperor confronted the War Master, standing alongside Sanguinius and Dorn as they breached the Vengeful Spirit's bridge. He watched his father unmake Horus, saw the War Master's soul not just destroyed, but erased from existence in ways that made retroactive his every choice and action. He witnessed the cost that erasure demanded, the pieces of the Emperor consumed in the working, the psychic architecture collapsing as their father's consciousness fragmented under pressures that would have vaporized lesser beings. Then he saw the Emperor's installation on the golden throne, the desperate measures taken to preserve what remained, and the look in his father's eyes as he understood what he would become. That vision haunted Guilliman more than any tactical nightmare or strategic catastrophe. If it represented true memory, information somehow embedded in his genetic code or transmitted through the Primarch's psychic connection, then he had witnessed his father's sacrifice, knowing it would birth the very theocracy the Emperor had fought to prevent. If it represented false memory, psychic infection, or psychological wish fulfillment, then its persistence suggested something deeply wrong with his cognitive functions, corruption or damage manifesting through symbolic hallucination. Either way, the vision implied questions Guilliman lacked the courage or perhaps the right to ask, questions about choice and necessity, about whether ends justified means when the means involved humanity's fundamental transformation. The war continued regardless of his uncertainty, the galaxy grinding forward through cycles of violence that felt less like history and more like eternal recurrence, the same battles fought in perpetual variation. Guilliman deployed his forces, managed his logistics, balanced competing priorities with the cold calculus that defined his approach to leadership. He made alliances where possible, compromised where necessary, accepted setbacks and leveraged victories, all while carrying the weight of 10,000 years of failure and the possibility that his returned brothers might make everything worse rather than better. He existed in that liminal space between hope and despair, the narrow margin where action remained possible despite outcome's uncertainty. And in the eye of terror, in the warp's deepest reaches, in places between places where reality became optional, the other Primarchs stirred in their various prisons and paradises. Some sensed Guilliman's return through the psychic resonance that connected all the Emperor's sons, a bond that even damnation and death could not entirely sever. Some prepared for confrontation, sharpening their blades and marshaling their forces for the brothers' war that seemed inevitable. Some prepared for reconciliation, imagining reunions that might heal wounds, or at least establish enough detente to address common threats. Some simply continued their eternal pursuits, caring nothing for imperial politics, viewing the Imperium itself as temporary phenomenon, doomed regardless of individual Primarchs' interventions. The question was not whether more Primarchs would return. The question was when, and in what states, and whether their returns would arrive soon enough to matter. The Imperium measured its remaining lifespan not in millennia, but in centuries, perhaps mere decades depending on which forecasts one credited. The Cicatrix Maledictum's existence guaranteed that even optimistic projections involved catastrophic territorial losses and population collapses. Every front was critical, every battle potentially decisive, every choice carrying consequences that would ripple through centuries of subsequent history. Guilliman existed at that knife's edge between salvation and annihilation, trying to architect victory from materials that would have seemed inadequate to manage simple survival. He thought of his father sometimes, the being who had created him and his brothers for purposes both transparent and obscure. The Emperor had been many things: tyrant and liberator, scientist and warlord, visionary and monster, depending on whose perspective one privileged. Guilliman had loved him, in the way one could love a creator who was also master and father and distant god. He had believed in the imperial truth, that rational explanation of humanity's place in cosmos, stripped of supernatural mysticism. Now he ruled an empire where that truth had been forgotten, replaced by superstitions more elaborate and powerful than anything old night had produced. The Emperor sat on his throne, perhaps conscious, perhaps not, perhaps transformed into something that made such categories meaningless, and Guilliman fought in his name, wondering if the being he served bore any resemblance to the father he remembered. The next Primarch to wake, if any did, would face this same horror, would open their eyes to a universe transformed beyond recognition. Guilliman could not decide if he hoped for that to happen or dreaded it, whether sharing the burden would provide relief or simply multiply the tragedy. His brothers had been warriors and builders, philosophers and monsters, each one a unique expression of the Emperor's genius turned towards specific purposes. The galaxy had broken them all in different ways, killed some and corrupted others, and simply driven a few into exile or madness. If they returned, if even a handful could be recovered and restored, what would they see when they looked at the Imperium? Would they recognize it as their father's work? Or would they see only the distorted echo that 10,000 years of institutional decay and theological perversion had created? These thoughts circled through Guilliman's transhuman consciousness as he planned campaigns and reviewed reports, the background noise of existential uncertainty underlying every tactical decision. He existed now as the only conscious bridge between the Imperiums, past and present, the sole surviving witness who remembered what had been meant versus what had actually manifested. That knowledge was both gift and curse, providing context that illuminated current problems while making solutions seem increasingly impossible. He could imagine the Imperium that should have existed, the secular humanist federation his father had intended, and that imagination made the theocratic nightmare he actually governed all the more painful to endure. But endure he did, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant extinction for the species that had birthed him. Whatever he had become, whatever horrors he perpetuated or facilitated through his leadership, he remained fundamentally committed to humanity's survival. That commitment overrode all other considerations, justified any necessary action, made tolerable any personal cost. If his brothers returned and proved to be allies, he would welcome them. If they returned and proved to be enemies, he would fight them. If they returned and proved to be something in between, he would adapt and manage and do whatever calculus deemed optimal under prevailing conditions. The war continued, as it always had and perhaps always would, the long war that began when Horus first embraced chaos and would end only when one side achieved complete victory or all sides collapsed from mutual exhaustion. Guilliman stood at its center. The avenging son returned from death to lead a crusade in a war that might have no conclusion, fighting for an Imperium he barely recognized in the name of an emperor who might have become something far stranger than any of his sons had imagined. He carried the weight of command with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his every action since his awakening, neither complaining nor wavering, the exemplar of duty that defined the Primarchs at their best. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, in places where light held no dominion and sanity became optional, his brothers waited. Some slept, some schemed, some simply existed in states that defied conventional description, but all of them remained, pieces scattered across the board of a game whose rules no player fully understood. The galaxy held its breath, or would have if galaxies possessed lungs, and breath, waiting for the moment when lost brothers would return and the war would truly resume in earnest. That moment approached, inevitable as entropy, carrying with it the possibility of salvation or damnation, or perhaps something worse than either. The Imperium prepared as best it could, marshalling forces and fortifying positions, while Robot Guilliman stood at its heart and wondered if he was ready to face what his brothers had become, or worse, to show them what 10,000 years had done to him. The future remained unwritten, or rather, written in formats and languages that mortal perception could not parse. The Imperium marched toward it regardless, one grinding step or at a time, carrying the accumulated weight of humanity's sins and aspirations towards some destination that might be oblivion or transcendence, or more likely, some state between the two that existing terminology could not adequately describe. And in that march, in that eternal struggle against odds that made optimism look like delusion, the Primarch's potential return represented humanity's last desperate play, the final gambit in a game that had been lost 10,000 years ago, but which no one had yet admitted defeat in. The galaxy burned, as it always had and always would, and in that burning, legends walked again among mortals, carrying with them the possibility that some fires could still illuminate rather than merely consume.